evening. Well, that was particularly strange because my browser wouldn't play either of those clips. So my only indication that the 30-second countdown was on was Andy Law dancing at the bottom of my screen to indicate when we were going live, which, without you realizing it, was really quite helpful for me. So welcome to Season 6, Episode 6 of Inside the Rookery. We last were joined by Matt Forbeck. Well, as a main guest, you did pop in for our birthday. You joined as a main guest all the way back in Season 1, Episode 3, talking about switching RPG rule sets. So
Yeah,
that's just about 2 years ago. Yeah. Wow. I can't believe it's been that long, but there we are. So we're really happy to welcome you back, Matt. This time to talk about the Marvel Multiverse Role-playing game. So welcome back to the stream.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Good to see you guys again.
Yeah, Seagoat's already said the same thing. Back to Matt Forbeck's castle with all the hidden rooms behind him.
That's right. Secret rooms.
Secret rooms, yep. So as always, we've got plenty of questions pre-submitted on Discord by patrons in our Discord community. And we have people already in the chat who may want to ask questions as well. So keep those comments and questions coming and I will bring them up on screen. Matt, would you like to do a brief introduction of yourself or shall we jump straight into the questions?
Well, for those who don't know me, I'm Matt Forbeck. I've been a game designer, a writer. I've got like 40-some novels published, countless games, worked on lots of different video games, comic books, all sorts of fun stuff. My latest thing is the Marvel role-playing game, Woo-hoo-hoo. It's in stores now. And other than that, you can find me at forbeck.com, which has got links to all my socials and such there too. So there you go.
It's fair to say many people think that Matt Forbeck might, in fact, be all the AI wrapped up in one. Since he produces so much, except unlike AI,
myself, I'll tell you that.
It's awesome.
The funny part is I actually have children who are now of the age where they're writing adventures with me, right? So
that's just brilliant.
I did this book for the Game Master. I did one adventure in this book, right? But if you can see right here at the tiny type, it's got me and Marty and Nicholas writing an adventure for it. And we're going to be doing some more stuff along those lines. Patrick, who's one of my quadruplets with Nicholas, is that's another thing. Of course, I got quadruplets. And Marty's my oldest, who's 24, who did a bunch of the Marvel game with me. But the quadruplets are now starting to write role-playing game stuff too. So Nicholas did some of that. And Patrick actually is doing a game design capstone class for his degree at UW-Whitewater, University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. And he is, as part of that, they needed to have him write a 5th edition adventure. At this time, somebody said, "Hey, would you like to write a short adventure for this?" I'm like, "Patrick, come on, we can do this." And we got permission from his teacher. We're like, "Hey, look, you can not only write this, turn in for a grade, you can get paid and get a credit. How awesome is that?" So
that is awesome. Our daughter is at Abertay studying games design and production. She's just gone into second year up in Dundee, so we should introduce them all.
Yeah, exactly. They can commiserate about how awful it is in the video game industry.
Yeah, Josie is wanting to specialize in sound design and composition.
Oh, very cool.
Her partner, she is specializing in, at the moment, 3D modeling, I understand. So, if you've got anyone that would fit with that triumvirate, let them know.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, Pat's more on the design side and the writing side. So, hey, they could actually form their own studio. Go because Christ, all the layoffs they've had in the video game industry. Like, well, you're not going to graduate till next year. Maybe they'll be better by then, right? So we'll see how it goes.
Yes, hers is 4 years, so she'll have this year and then 2 more years to go. And I'm saying to her, like, just think about it. Just like work out how you can launch your own thing. Don't go and work for the man.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of it because all these guys get laid off all the time. Dennis Detwiller is a friend of mine. He works with what's the name of the company? Arc Dream, right? They do Delta Green. And he was a top video game producer for like 15 years with Warner Brothers. And now he lives on a seaside farmhouse in British Columbia in Canada. He's like, what the hell was I ever doing? Right? This is the best thing ever. And, don't sell your time to people who won't respect you. You're going to fire you at the first moment. You got to eat, but it's much better to do it your own way if you can pull it off. So, and I've been very fortunate to be able to do that for many years now. So, set a very poor example for my children that way. That they're like, no, we're going to do this. I'm like, oh no, what are you doing? This is hard. But I suppose it's better than getting laid off by other people. So
It really is. It's quite so many of my friends have been laid off recently as well. It's just a little bit. Ugh.
I know. You're like, oh,
It's just another sad post from someone saying, "I've had this X amount of time doing this, and I'm very sad to be in this position." You're just, you send the commiserations, and away you go.
We didn't come here to have a we didn't come here to have a family catch up.
There we go.
Came to talk about a role-playing game.
Yeah, we can bullshit forever, right? That's the thing.
Yeah, we could. So I'm going to jump into the questions. So Keravan has asked, did you start with a blank page for the new edition?
I assume you're talking about the Marvel game. Yeah, kind of. I started out talking to John Nee, who was the publisher of Marvel Comics at the time. And John said, well, this is what we're looking for. We're hoping that you can design this for us. And John had some ideas, and then we brought in another designer named Mike Capps, who was with Epic Games, who's one of the, very intelligent, talented guy who did a lot of writing for Epic Games over the years, wrote Gears of War and Fortnite and bunches of other stuff people might have heard of, right? But John was like, we want to make this a game that, we're together on this point. We wanted a game that you could have that. One of the problems for people who design games a lot is that we start designing games for ourselves and our peers because that's what we're most interested in, right? And because of that, the market for that narrows pretty tightly, right? I want to impress my friends. I want to do stuff that at my level, because I've been doing this for 40 years, I want to do something that's going to impress me and be new. The market for people who've been playing role-playing games for 40 years or designing them is pretty freaking small, right? So, if you want to sell a big game and have it do well in, Target and Walmart and Amazon, whatever, you need to broaden your field. So we said, okay, what's the biggest role-playing game market in the world right now? Obviously, it's people who play Dungeons and Dragons, right? So we wanted something that we weren't going to do a clone of 5e or anything like that, but we wanted something that if you played 5e and you understand typical role-playing games, because, that again is the biggest one in the world, that you would feel comfortable coming over to our game, right? You wouldn't say, I don't get it. It doesn't fit the same model, right? So we wanted to make something that would fit the model so that if you could say, okay, I understand D&D, so I can sidestep my way into this, and now this is cooler, right? Also, we wanted something that was simple enough that people who are RPG curious, right? Marvel fans who are RPG curious, but maybe thought that, waving around a sword and wearing a pointed hat or ears was goofy, and they wouldn't be caught dead doing that, but spandex and capes were fine. Those are the people that we're going to come after as well. So we wanted something that would appeal to both of those groups, right? So something that was simple, but still held with a lot of the pillars that you often see in traditional role-playing games. And that's really where we started when we came up with our own writing on that blank page, right? And that was what we started with when we moved into the new edition. So, and, I looked at all the other editions. I had played all the other editions. I ran FaZe-Rip back when I was 16, 17 years old at Gen Con for Jeff Grubb and Steve Winter, right? Who are now good friends of mine, who are the designers of the original edition. I've known them for decades now. Steve ran the first game I ever played at a convention back in 1983, I think. So a Blue Hill game. And I also was on the design team for the last edition, the Margaret Weiss edition that came out, that Cam Banks was the lead designer on. And I was part of his Illuminati team of consultants that were coming up with how we wanted the game to be. So having been through all that, I thought, this is really what we want to do for something like this. We want to have something that isn't too quirky, is kind of straightforward, but simple enough that people have never played a role-playing game before can dive right into it, but still has enough crunch and intricacies and wrinkles that a veteran role player can look at and say, oh, there's something fun I could play with here too. Hopefully we hit it. That was our aim, at least.
So you've sort of answered this already, but it was Kevin's follow-up question was, how aware were you of the previous Marvel RPG?
So very
aware. Yeah.
I actually have my map from the original FaZe laminated. I got laminated, shield laminating at Gen Con back when it first came out. And I still have it in one of my closets back here, right? It's and we used it for playtesting. I mean, we're like, okay, do we want to do areas? I'm like, areas are kind of goofy. And then if you're like in the old FaZe-Rip game, you didn't have like move 5-step foots or whatever. You had or spaces. You had areas that you moved into. The problem is that meant that the game master had to be able to design all this stuff and know how the areas work and be comfortable with it. And just laying a grid over anything is much simpler for somebody. So I'm like, no, let's not do the areas. Let's do a grid. People understand grids. There's nothing you have to say like, well, if it's more open and spacey, then the areas are bigger. I'm like, nah, that's goofy. Let's make it something that you can actually understand. Not too heavy on the math, though. We actually did a playtest edition. It came out in April of 2022. That was a $10, 120-page, like, hey, what do you think of this kind of a book, right? And the math in that was much stronger, much more demanding. So one of the things we did when we got a lot of feedback from people from the public playtest. We tore that to the studs, essentially. And, like I said, Mike Capps, great designer, really brilliant guy, has a doctorate in mathematics, went to MIT for undergrad. And so I'm trusting him on all the stats. I mean, it's great stuff he was doing with the dice mechanic and everything else. But, after he ended up having to leave the project, I'm working on it by myself. And I'm like going, oh, okay, I'm having a hard time getting the math here occasionally. And I took 4 terms of calculus in college. If I'm struggling with this a bit, we need to make this easier for people so that it's more transparent, right? And that's what we ended up doing. We kept the die mechanic, which was great, but we got rid of a lot of the higher end math or the triple digit math that was going on, stuff that people can't do in their heads, essentially, and made it more simple. So one thing we struggled with was like, should we go with multiplication at all? Because a lot of games, people are like, oh, multiplication, that's evil, right? But I'm like, if we do single digit multiplication, the kind of stuff you learned in 3rd grade here, I think maybe we could pull that off. And it seems like it works pretty well. So got us from going to a roll to hit and look up your roll to hit, roll to damage thing to a 1 roll system where you can roll it, look at it, and see both your damage and whether or not you succeeded at what you were doing. So much simpler and faster and more intuitive, actually, once it's been explained to you.
How did you find the whole cutting process? Because that sounds like it would have been a tough job.
Oh, the best part is after you publish a game, you always go, God, I wish I could have done that different, right?
Yeah.
Every time. You're like, oh, man, there's so much more I could have done. Even now with the game, which I'm pretty happy with, I'm still like, oh, I could have done that different. Maybe this would have been better. So for me, that was like, let's just rip things out and see what still stands, right? So we had an archetype system that was similar to D&D classes. And after looking, I'm like, I don't see what this actually serves us here except to complicate the game. It forces people to go into these certain areas, and we're coming up with some archetypes just so that they will be specialized in certain attributes. And I'm like, pitch it. It's not helping at all, right? It's not a good framework for the rest of the game. So we just threw that away, and that drastically simplified the game again. I'm like, oh, that's just felt better to be free of that, right? So ripping it down to the studs was great. It was often humbling, right? We did a lot of the public playtest. We had tens of thousands of people coming in and giving us feedback, which was fantastic. Thank you to all the people who did that. We really did appreciate that. We had a guy named Amir Osman, who was the associate producer, assistant producer at Marvel, who went through all that and collated it and said, okay, 35% of the people think this and 85% of the people think this. I'm like,
wow.
Okay, thank God we had him doing it because it would have taken me forever. But we had him, we had CJ Cervantes, who was my producer, and Brian Overton, who was our editor. Fantastic team to work with. And they really kept me on target the whole time. Every time I started talking a little too gamery or grognardy or whatever, they're like, what are you no, we need to do this. And I'm like, okay, great. So the whole idea was to make it fun. And CJ would often say, yeah, you can do that, but is it more fun? I'm like, okay, that's a good point. We should probably think about that. Because when you're a game designer, you're like, oh, new, shiny, that's cool. I want to go for that. Like, is it actually more fun? If it's not, you kill it, right? And we had some private play tests we did at Comic-Con. And we had some friends come in, and one of them just took the game's damage system, broke it over her knee. I was like, oh, no. Oh, it's totally screwed. And that was actually one of the things where like, maybe we should go with multiplication here because it actually makes a lot more sense and it's not quite as crazy. And then her husband, this was Whitney Beltran and Aja George, right? And Aja comes in and he's like, I need to be able to understand everything in the character sheet. Like, you know what? You're right. We need to make sure everything you can want to have to play with is right there in front of you. You don't have to flip open a book. You could just do this right here. And it really did focus on some of the things, making it a game that people could use and play at the table. Right.
There's a few questions in the chat. I don't think you did have anything to. Have you seen the map from the new game, Andy? Did you?
I was typing something right there. That was really perfectly timed. I was just about to send a message. No, not at all. I haven't seen the map for the new game, and no, I did not work on it. Do I approve? Of course, I approve. Although I've not seen it yet.
There's a map that was in the original playtest version, and then Brian Patterson has been doing the maps for us. He's been doing it each. One of the cool things we did. I'll have to dig it out some other time. We actually had them printed up on like mouse pads, those big ones you see for desks nowadays. And then, there's like 3 levels of this building, the Howard and Maria Stark building. You're investigating at Empire State University. And we had them printed up on mouse pads, so I can actually use those for demos when I'm playing a game. It's fantastic. But yes, I gave them a whole list of people to look at. Andy's name was on it.
It was, I think. Yeah.
Once it gets past, I'm a freelancer for them. I don't get to make these decisions. Which is also very convenient for me because I have lots of friends saying, "Hey, Matt, I'd love to write for that game." Like, yes, I know. I will put you on this list. And when they ask me who wants to write for it, I will give them the list, and we'll see what that happens.
Seagoat says, from Matt, what you're speaking about, it sounds like Marvel were helpful during the whole process. Is this the actual case?
They were fantastic. In fact, this is a game published by Marvel, right? A lot of people are like, "Oh, it's a licensed game, blah, blah." No, it's not a licensed game. It's not, it's not Wizards doing it. It's not Cryptozoic. It's not Fantasy Flight, whatever. This is actually published by Marvel Comics, right? So, which is now part actually of Marvel Entertainment. They've done restructuring. So my guys actually, if you go up the chain, report to like Kevin Feige and stuff. It's kind of crazy. So when we're talking about that, it's I'm working with a small team inside of Marvel. It's not the entire Marvel. Like obviously, the guys doing the movies have other things to do than to think about whether or not this role-playing game is going to go well. But they were fantastically involved, and it also meant that we could tap on all the artwork. We have all their internal libraries. We can just have the guys go into and use. If we have questions about something, they can tap the editor of the current comic book. Like we have X-Men questions because I'm working on an X-Men book now, and they can just reach over and tap. I think it's Jordan White on the shoulder and say, "Hey, what are we? Does this fit up?" And he could say, "Well, no, that's not quite where we're headed." Whatever. They're tight with me about secret information. I get to know stuff that's a little bit ahead of time, but not very far. Because, honestly, a lot of the guys on the comic book side don't know what's happening in other divisions of the comic book company, mind you, right? Yeah. Much less, what's happening in film and television and everything else. So we try to coordinate things so they'll be exciting. Like when I came up with the name for the game, I gave them a list of names. And I'm like, it could be blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, and let me try this one because the last one you guys published at Marvel, they only published one before, was the Marvel Universe, which was the 3rd edition of the game. And I'm like, well, since it's a bigger thing nowadays, how about we call it the Marvel Multiverse Role-playing game? And they're like, oh, you know what? Yeah, that's going to work. And I'm like, I have no idea. I didn't know at the time why, right? Because it was before they announced the whole multiverse saga. And I'm like, okay, good. Well, I like it. Let's go with it. Then when I saw the announcement, I'm like, okay, guys, you weren't telling me, but that's what you were doing. Okay.
So were they involved with?
It's like the literal definition of serendipity.
So did Marvel get involved with the nitty gritty of the stats, the building of that side, or were they very much hands off? You build it, we'll be more concerned about, say, the color of it the nature of it, or were they quite keen on drilling down and saying, no, there should be a bit of this and there should be a bit of that?
Well, with the guys I was working with, again, so it was a small team. So there's 3 guys at Marvel I work with directly, and then there's other people too. There's like the PR guys and the business guys and etc. But the 3 main guys, CJ, Amir, and Brian that I worked with. They were all, hands in on everything, and in a good way, not like hey, let's just put our fingers on it. Sometimes you work with people and they're like, let's just put our fingers on it so that I could say I did this, right? They were never like that. They're always like, let's see how we can make this better. If I don't understand this, then we need to re-explain it because I'm part of the market we're shooting at, is what they would tell me, right? I'm like, great, you're right. So they were fantastic. They were really amazing. They had lots of great suggestions. And, sometimes, we'd butt heads and there'd be like, bam, bam. And like sometimes I would win, sometimes they'd win, but it was never a fight. It was like, okay, we want this thing to be the best thing possible. And if CJ, for instance, says, I like this, and I have to say, that's not going to work, and this is why. Now, if I can't explain why it doesn't work, and I start thinking about it, I'm like, you know what? God damn it, you might be right. And then we have to go chase what he wanted, right? So we were all being really reasonable and collegial and, buddies with each other, really, too. By the time we finished this, we're all friends, right? And they were really wonderful to work with, still are, and I really enjoyed working with them. I would recommend it to anybody. It was not one of these things where like somebody's saying, no, you can't do that. But we had arguments, things like we have power ranks in the game, right? You're kind of like levels, but there's only 6 of them, and it's like, if you're a Shield agent, you're rank 1. If you're Daredevil, you're rank 2. If you're Miles Morales, you're rank 3, Spider-Man rank 4, et cetera, all the way up to Captain Marvel at rank 6. And we're like, oh, I'm like, Daredevil has to be rank 2. And they're like, no, man, Daredevil's too cool to be rank 2. I'm like, well, You have a point there, but he's still rank 2. Right? As you look at his powers, he's basically just a martial artist who has a superpower that corrects for the fact that he's blind, right? I'm like, that's not really, Spider-Man's going to kick his ass in a fight, right? Miles will kick his ass because they have superpowers. Daredevil's superpowers is super senses. That's about it. The rest of it's all training and fighting, whatever. And so they're like, okay, fine. But still, we want him to be higher. I'm like, you know what? One of the great things about role-playing games is that our fans who complain about this stuff can go build their own version, right? Because we have full character creation rules in the game. So every one of the characters in the game, there's 130 profiles in the main book. If you like them, great. They're all, but if you don't, you go make your own. But every one of those is actually uses the character creation rules to be created. So we didn't cheat on any of those. We didn't say, well, we're Marvel and that's Spider-Man, so we can make him better. We said, well, we're going to use the character creation rules there. So every one of those is an example of how to do it properly, right? And if you say, well, I think he should be ranked 3, then you got more tools to play with and toys to play with. And you can make it however you want. So part of the main pillars of the game is we're trying to encourage people rather than discourage people, right? So we'd say, for instance, when we had, we're trying to come up with a way for people to do themed characters, like, if you're a martial arts guy, why don't you have like 16 things from all these different types of powers and just a grab bag? Because it doesn't make sense and it doesn't feel right, right? So we have power sets, and we don't say you're limited to a certain number of power sets like we did in the original playtest. We say you get a bonus, you get extra powers if you stick within power sets. But you can do whatever the hell you want. We're not trying to tell you not to do it. If you got a great idea for a character and it doesn't fit, we're going to give you an open framework to mess around in.
So
Nice.
Smiling Tom, just talking about the rank, Smiling Tom had asked, and he'd put in a little bit more, but I couldn't fit it in, but I'll contextualize it, saying Marvel Universe is particularly known for having a huge range of capabilities. And you team together plain skilled humans with literal gods. But what he follows up with, of course, not everything is combat in a game, but how have you balanced that?
The way we balance is, again, by using that rank system, right? So Hawkeye and Daredevil, for instance, are rank 2. Spider-Man's rank 4. Wolverine's rank 4. So that gives you an idea about the kinds of encounters, the kind of challenges you're going to encounter in the game, right? So if you want to, battle your way through Hell's Kitchen, you probably want rank 2 characters, right? If you want to save Manhattan, you probably want rank 3 or 4 characters. If you want to go on a cosmic adventure to save the universe, you need rank 5 or 6 characters, right? And so that helps balance it out. There's also a big chapter, narrator's advice. And the narrator is the game master in our game. And in that, we talk about things like when you're designing a game or an adventure, when you're doing it on the fly with friends, you need to make sure that everybody has something that they can do that makes them feel useful and gives them the spotlight as they go. And that's more of a narrator type decision than a mechanical type decision, right? Well, one of the great powers of role-playing games is that there's a human being at the table who's guiding the game, right? It's not meant to be a computer game. And so that because of that, there's so many different thousands, millions, billions of possibilities that can happen in a game. We need that human person there saying, okay, Jody over here hasn't got enough attention and she's only playing this shield agent. We need to give her something exciting to do and make her feel like she's part of the game. That's really what you do when you do it. There's not a mechanical way for doing it, but we talk about it, we discuss about it, and teach you how to do those things in the book.
So how did you find the, if it is an issue at all, the scaling of one type of character when they're pitching against another type of character? Is that a concern or a worry, or were you much more concerned with ensuring that the rank 3s worked well with rank 3s rather than rank 1s, say, working well and say hand in hand with rank 5s or pitched against?
Oh, rank 1s, if they're fighting a rank 5, are going to get their butts kicked.
Yeah.
If Thor comes up to Hawkeye and starts pounding with the Mjolnir, it's not realistic to say that, Hawkeye's going to pull out something and take out Thor. That's fine. That's actually the way the characters are written. That's the way that people would expect that to go. So we're not trying to design a game where any character could take on any other character. We do have an exception to the whole thing called rank X. So if you're like Galactus or Infinity or one of these high concept characters that basically has near infinite power or absolutely infinite power, we don't give you stats at all. You're what we call a narrative character, right? So rank X is what that is. That means we can talk about how your powers affect other people, but we don't give you hit points. We don't give you any of that kind of stuff. There's no restrictions on them. One, it frees us up from a narrator's point of view. to say this is the kind of thing, these are things that are beyond the player's abilities to do. These are things that, godlike characters can do, the Beyonder, for instance, or the Molecule Man. And these are powers that wouldn't make it a fun game for you. I mean, if you can rewrite reality, what the hell's the point of anything, right? Is it really a challenge to solve a mystery in the streets of Hell's Kitchen if you can rewrite reality? I mean, shouldn't you be better off like trying to feed the poor? Stuff like this, right? So we put in rank X, and again, we didn't give them stats because it's one of those things that we learned in first edition AD&D, where if you give a character stats, people kill it, right? If you give Orcus stats, suddenly he's something that people want to slaughter. Like, okay, these are beyond that kind of stuff. We're making them. Mephisto might end up with stats because he's a character people get to punch, right? Kang ends up with stats because he's a character people like to punch, even though he's very powerful. So but what you get beyond that, we say these are beyond what we're playing on the table here for combat. They're just going to function in that narrative sense.
Mm-hmm.
And do you provide a host of, I presume, narrative tools for dealing with your godlike entities?
Yeah, of course, right? I mean, it's again, a lot of it's advice, right? That this is how you should handle this kind of stuff, as opposed to here's a rule, right? Again, we try to make it so it's open for people. People are like, "Can I do this in my game?" I'm like, "Man, it's your table. Do your house. Do what you want to." There's one of the opening parts of the book has a big thing on getting together with your players and discussing the kind of game you want to play and making sure everybody's comfortable. My main role in any kind of a role-playing game is if you and everybody else at the table is enjoying yourself, you're doing it right. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Doesn't matter if you're going by the rules or not. If everybody's having a fun time, why would I step in there and say you're doing it wrong, right? Now, I might say that's not going according to the rules written, and I think you might have a better time doing it this way, or it might be more balanced, whatever. But if you're enjoying yourselves and having a blast, don't ask me if you're doing it right. You're doing it right. You're having a good time. These are tools that we hand other people to play, to create stories with each other and have a good time and have adventures, right? If the guys who provide you with power tools and saws and stuff don't say, no, you're doing that wrong. They'll give you safety things like, okay, you need glasses. Don't put your thumb on the saw, in the way of the saw, stuff like that. We'll do that too. But what you do with those after we've given them to you is really up to you.
Suejin says, I love the idea of rank X. I recently saw GM Deborah Anvil run a rank X boss encounter in Children of Irte. I don't know how to pronounce that, which the PCs eventually succeeded against. It was also a great example of how to make an apparent TPK not be the end of the road. And then Seagoat says this, which I think is an interesting point. Stats don't define the creature's power. They define what the players need to defeat it. Right. So you could, they could retreat. They could, they're not necessarily, well, this has this many wounds and is going to die. But you could come up with a clever way to defeat something that is... Yeah.
Now, for instance, we have an adventure coming out called The Cataclysm of Kang, which comes in November. And it's a 256-page hardcover book. And it has one adventure for each rank. So there's 6 ranks in the game. And it starts out rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It goes basically from street level, cop level type stuff in Little Italy, all the way up to saving the entire multiverse, right? And if you want to, you can create your own characters and take them all the way from your origin story up to your cosmic level stuff, right? Now in the book, we have guidelines for like you get a rank cap, right? So if you really want to do like X-Men style adventures, those are usually around rank 4, right? So you want to bring your character up to rank 4 because that's where you're going to have the best challenge to that. If you go beyond that, maybe not so much, then you're doing these cosmic things that the X-Men are maybe not as excited about doing. Or if the cosmic guys come down and just plow the X-Men in the ground, that's a villain's role, not a character's role, right? So you can take your character all the way from rank 1 to rank 6, all the way through these adventures. You play them in any order you want, have whatever kind of fun you want. But the whole idea was to give people different ways to play and to show them how to do different adventures at different ranks, right? So in rank 6, we have this massive villain that I don't want to spoil for anybody yet, but it's pretty cool. I'm really excited about him. And he's a rank X character, right? So when he shows up, you're like, well, how do you defeat him? And there's no stats here. So there's a long section. You're like, these are the only things that have been established that could defeat this kind of character. Here's the ways you might go about doing this. And honestly, I mean, once you get to rank 6 type characters, you're talking like, cosmos shaking stuff. There's so many different possibilities for people to come up with. So we're just giving ideas, right? And if they come up with another idea and the game master says, sure, that's okay too, right? We encourage people to. I mean, you guys have run lots of games, right? You've been in games. All of a sudden, the characters all come up with a different idea, and the game master's like, "Holy cow! I would never have thought of that." Right?
Every
That's how it
time.
is. You know, that's how it is. You just can't. So we try to give them guidelines about how you might pull this kind of stuff off, or if you have new players and they're not quite familiar with that, you want to kind of push them gently in one direction or the other to give them that path. But if they come up with their own path, let them run it. Have fun. Again, fun is the main name of the game. That's what we really want people to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess in a way this has almost been answered then. Caravan asks what makes a good superhero RPG. Is that different to what makes a good Marvel RPG? But maybe having a think about those two things separately would be a...
We have had some people say the character creation system power system isn't robust enough because it doesn't allow us to create any kind of possible character of any kind of setting. I'm like, that's absolutely right. That's intentional, right? That's not a mistake. That's because we're always going, is this a Marvel game? It's not a generic superhero game. It's not a generic game. It's not a generic role-playing game, right? It's meant to be a Marvel game. So it's flavored with Marvel stuff all the way through. Honestly, that's our biggest selling point. There's no reason why we would say, let's make this a generic thing that just happens to having Marvel slapped on it, right? We want to lean into that direction and give it as much Marvel flavor as we can. And again, that's one of the things the guys at Marvel were always leaning on me for. I'm like, well, what about this? And they're like, no, does that seem very Marvel to you? I mean, there was at one point where we had these damage reduction rules, for instance, and they worked really well for things like Iron Man and Hulk's skin that was bulletproof, and Colossus and things like that. And then CJ steps up and says, "What about Invisible Woman's force field? Does it work for that?" I'm like, "Actually, no, it doesn't work for that." So we had to come up with a whole new way to do damage protection as opposed to damage reduction. And so you shatter a force shield by doing enough damage against in a single round, essentially, right? You can keep pounding away at it until it goes away. But whereas with regular armor, it reduces the amount of damage that comes through. So it can knock you around. But these things are static until they're broken, right? So we try to model the mechanics that we had around the way things work in the Marvel universe, as opposed to whatever you might come up with for whatever generic game you're working on, right? So, and if we ever do another version of the game for some other property, who the hell knows? Marvel owns, Disney owns boatloads of things, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if we ever did that, we would lean in the direction of that property for those too. We would take those things, those mechanics, those powers, whatever, and lean in that direction. So, so that's what makes a good superhero RPG. I think you want to lean on the things that superhero stories are famous for. And honestly, one of the big things is big battles, right? Big climactic blockbuster battles. So some people are like, well, why is there combat in this? Why is combat such a focus in this game? I'm like, I have to tell you, as much as there's
have you read the comics?
All these things. And honestly, a lot of the time, people around a table who are doing role-playing games are able to handle the drama verbally, right? You could say, the person acts like this, and then we'll roll a die to see whether or not it works. But sometimes you don't even roll the dice, right? You're like, that sounds great. That seems like that would work. That seems like that was heartfelt. This is appropriate for the moment. But when somebody says, I want to punch this guy and knock him across the room, that's a lot harder to model, right? So that's the reason we do the combat system and make it more fun that way. One of the things we did with the dice system is we made it so that it leans into doing critical hits really often, right? So in the Marvel, for instance, in D&D, you get a critical hit out of 20, right? It does double damage. It's 5% of the time. So in our game, we have these special dice, right? You can use any 6-sided dice you want, but these are the 616 dice system. So you might have noticed that one of those in the middle is a off-color die. So if you could steal dice from your Yahtzee box or Monopoly or whatever you have it sitting around, and just say one of these is the Marvel die. It's the special die. If you roll 1 on the Marvel die, it counts as a 6, and something special happens, right? So if you roll the dice, I say you just add them up, right? Like you would, like, okay, I got a 2, a 3, and a 5. That's 10, right? Then you add your attribute to it. If that goes over the target number, then you succeed. Or it meets or beats the target number, you succeed. But if you get a Marvel result, then you get double damage. And if you're using a power, something special happens. Whatever that power is, it has if you get a fantastic result, then this happens, right? Every power's got that written into it. So it's tailored again to feel very Marvel. But also it means that when you're playing in the middle of a game, you get a lot of those tack, 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 and then boom hits, right? So you're not just chipping away at something. You're always going to get something exciting happening. One of the other neat things about that is because of the way the dice work, we have these. You can spend a karma point and re-roll one of the dice, right? Or you can get which you can earn by doing cool things in the game. And every hero gets a few karma points to start with. So you can just re-roll one of the dice and take the better result. If something is having trouble, you have to re-roll the die and take a worse result. But one of the neat things about the way the dice work, and there's some hidden math in there. When you roll the dice, the Marvel die also determines your damage. So you take that Marvel die, multiply it by your rank, and that's your damage. And sometimes, like if you're super strong, you do extra damage, or if you're shooting somebody and you're super accurate, you do extra damage. But let's say you got a 3 on the Marvel die and you're rank 4. That's 12 points of damage, right? But if you got the Marvel die comes up as the Marvel logo or a 1, and that's 6 it counts as, times rank 4 is 24. Double that to 48 points of damage, right? Plus whatever your attribute is. And then you get the special effect as well. The neat thing about that is if you are struggling to hit somebody, right? It's the last battle, and you're trying to punch out Thanos, and you need like a 20 to hit him, and you're maybe you can get a 20 if you get all the dice to line up perfectly, and all your friends pitch in and they're giving you edges so you can re-roll the dice, and you finally manage to get it. Boom. Now in some games, if you finally get that hit, then you roll for damage, and the damage roll could be, I finally hit the dragon, I stab him in the chest, and I roll for damage, I get 2. And like, oh, well, that's unsatisfying, right? But because of the way the multiplication works, in order to get that huge hit, you're going to have to get a really large number, right? The chances of you getting a good number on your Marvel roll are much bigger, right? So if you do get that, you're probably going to get double damage. You're always going to get some pretty substantial damage. It's never going to be a tink. It's going to be bam. And if you're lucky, it's going to be knocking the guy through the wall, right? And that's inherent math built into the system that we literally don't explain in the book. It just happens, right? Because that's probably my favorite mechanic in the whole game, where it's just built in there. It's nice. It's elegant. Nobody has to tell you how to add anything together. It just happens no matter what you do. Right.
I really like the sound of that. And I really I can see Andy nodding because he's a bit of a mechanics geek. So he's like soaking all this up. I could see you nodding before when Matt was describing something. You were like, yes, I like it. But I like it because it's elegant, but it also feels like Marvel. Like as you're describing that, I can understand that. And I wouldn't want to play a Marvel game and not feel like I was in a comic or a film. Like what would be the point? I might as well go and play something else. So I really, absolutely. And you can do that. You can do that with tone, like Andy Law making our crawls every time we had an episode of our Star Wars role-playing game, and he started it with a crawl on his iPad. Like that set the tone. But if the tone is continued and perpetuated through the mechanics, I mean, that's the dream. It's a thing of beauty.
Exactly. No, you always strive for that as a designer. It's tough because it doesn't always happen, right? But you want to have something that's elegant enough that it just feels right. It's intuitive. People play with it. They don't need, it just happens by itself almost. But it's all designed. I mean, like I remember playing Ticket to Ride the first time. I'm like, man, this seems like a really simple game, but the math on the goddamn board is so intense. And you know that Alan Moon went through and figured it all out. You're like, but that's the designer's job. The designer's job is to do the hard math and all that stuff, so you don't have to as a player. But it engineers a really fun experience for you either way, right?
To boil back on something that I think we all know as well, it's the beauty of a game like, say, Space Hulk, where the actual maths of Space Hulk is exceedingly simple, but the level design, making the number of counted squares, ensuring that certain things happen at certain points, that's where it really shone. That's where so much thought was put in. But the basic mechanic that sat behind it was super simple for everyone to engage with. And then they're like, oh, this game's easy. Just go, oh, wait a minute. And then you learned as you played that the game was much more complex and there's a great deal more going to it than you might have gleaned from the rules alone.
Which is an interesting contrast with Lost Patrol, which is completely mathematically impossible to win. Another Games Workshop game, fighting Tyranids in the jungle. And it's just impossible to win. And it doesn't say that. Like if... maybe that's the point of it. Who knows? No one's ever opined, but Andy put up rules on his blog to make it actually... like maybe that's the point. It's like a lesson from the Imperium about the futility of fighting.
Now, my favorite mechanic in Space Hulk is one of my favorite mechanics of all time is that egg timer, right? That they're stuck in there. So if you're one of the gene stealers, you have all the time in the world. You can plot everything out, whatever. If you're on the Marine side, It's like your turn starts, flip, and you're like, oh, I have plenty of time. Oh, you know, you're dying at the end. And it feels like that panic of battle. You're like, oh my God. It just, because I'm much slower and lumberier than these guys. So I'm timed it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's perfect, right?
Agreed. Chef kiss. Brilliant.
So we did cover this a little bit before, because you did have the opportunity after the playtest to do, and it sounded like you did rip out a lot of things and change things. But say you were starting again tomorrow from scratch. Killishandra asks, if you started again from scratch, would you do anything differently this time? Oh,
sure. Just because I like to entertain myself, right? Who wants to do the same thing twice, right?
Yeah, and it's the multiverse, so you would have to do it slightly differently.
I think we did it with something pretty close to what we have. At the end, I was kind of toying with some different ideas for damage that wouldn't involve hit points at all and just wounds and stuff like that. Maybe make it even simpler that way. But I didn't have time to play test that. We had something really robust in place already, so I didn't do that. It was like, well, we could try that, but then we'd have to, let's just go with what we have right now. But that's the thing about being a designer. You always look at this and you're like, well, what can I do to make it better, right? And that's the reason that you always get different editions of games. It's not because, well, for sometimes, if you're doing like big things like D&D, it's because, well, sales are flagging, and we know that if we do another edition, it's going to take off. But it's also because it's a chance to do things better. I mean, when second edition D&D came along, it was like, it was a much more improved version of first edition, right? And when third edition came along too, it was like, oh, we just take all this stuff and like, let's go strip it down to brass tacks and, see if we are right to the studs again and move up from there. Oh, it's just, much more mathematically robust system. I actually was designing for second edition and then third edition came out. I'm like, oh, this is a headache. Because now I have to there's an answer for everything. It's all mathematically correct. In second edition, you're like, it works.
It's so true.
But third edition, like, oh, I did a third edition book called The Redhurst Academy of Magic, which had 20 20th level wizards in it, right? And it took me like a half a day to stat out each one of them because there was just so much involved. And that's, again, though, that's what the designer is getting paid for. You're getting paid for doing that work to make sure that's fun, that the math all works, everything's there. So I didn't complain about it, but it was a bigger challenge than what previously I just said, well, it looks like this, and boom, and you're good. But now I'm like, well, I have to build this by the rules. And, that's kind of the same thing with the Marvel thing. When we're doing it, we build it by the rules, just so it serves as a perfect example for people who want to do this on their own.
Yep, like that.
Let's have a look at the questions. So here's a random generic one. Killishandra asks, you can answer too, Andy. What's your favorite Marvel character? So get thinking.
Well, I have two. Well, Spider-Man's always been my favorite, Peter Parker, right? Since I was a kid, I learned how to read on Spidey comics, the ones from the Electric Company, which came on after Sesame Street when I was a kid, right? And there's a character named Easy Reader come up and say, hey, kids, reading is cool. He's this black guy with a beanie and skinny guy. Come up, slap me some skin, Spider-Man, and give. That guy turns out to have been Morgan Freeman, believe it or not, in one of his earliest roles. But so I learned how to read, watching that stuff and reading Spidey comics. And so I've always been a big Spider-Man fan all my life. Also, I was like an asthmatic kid with glasses, and I'm like, oh, he's just like me. I see that. Yeah. So representation does matter. Which I'm not trying to mock that. I actually do believe that. I think it's great that we have all this great diversity and inclusion in comic books and in games nowadays. We're better than it used to be, at least. But, for me, Spider-Man was always the best. Then I wrote a Captain America book about 7 years ago, something like that, a guide for DK Publishing, after I'd written a couple editions of the Marvel Encyclopedia, and I wrote an Avengers Encyclopedia. And they're like, now we want you to write a book about Captain America. And I got to research and write about his entire history, everything that happened to him all the time. I'm like, such a great character. This is the guy, again, it's Captain America, right? America's got lots of problems and lots of issues, but this is the America we all want, is the one that Captain America wants, right? He's just such a great character. And so I kind of fell in love with him too. That's the Steve Rogers version, even though Sam Wilson is fantastic. It's just so much fun as well.
My answer is going to be, sadly, a little bit of dittoing here. I grew up reading Spider-Man, and I had all of the comics. My dad was a bit of a comics nerd, and we had a variety of Marvel and other comics that were in the house throughout my childhood. They've been picking up since the 60s and the 70s.
Your mum was a comic
Yeah.
artist.
And my mum worked for DC Thompson's. Now, DC Thompson's, for those of you who don't know, are a Dundee-based comic book company in Scotland, but they make kids' comics like the Beano and the Dandy and things like that. They did Dennis the Menace, the British version, not the American. And she worked as the colorist on a whole host of titles. My dad worked as a photographer for the front covers, because back then you didn't have it in a computer. They took photographs of the various things that were put together inside the studio, and then they were then used. And that's where my dad worked. At that point, my dad's done every job in the known universe. So my dad had tons of comics, but Spider-Man was the one that stuck with me because I read them at exactly the right age. I was that kid. And it was in that representation matters way, the one where you go, oh yeah, oh wow. And you just get caught up with all the stories and the drama. And often the fights were significantly less important than the things that were being said. And that for me stuck. And became a part of, when we then moved on to role-playing games and similar, a part of the very similar, almost archetypical tales that were getting retold in different ways in different worlds. So seeing a game like the Marvel RPG is always going to make me go ka-ching ching with a big smile, because it taps into my childhood. And yeah, super pleased. But yeah, Spider-Man, I know it's incredibly dull, but that was the character that I grew up with.
Yeah, I've heard you say that lots of times, that in your heart, like, other characters are cool, but in your heart, you'll always be that boy that loves Spider-Man. I think that's really sweet. Whereas I lived in the country with no TV and parents who certainly would not even have bought me a comic of that kind. Like, maybe they would have bought me a Bunty annual. I don't even know. Yeah.
Also DC Thompson.
But only at Christmas. And so I didn't really come to Marvel till much later on in life. And as a result, I guess, I don't really have a favorite character. You know, like when there's the one true chocolate, and it's usually the chocolate you got on pick celebration of your choice, if it's Christmas or Hanukkah or, Ramadan at the end of fasting. That's like your chocolate, even if it's disgusting and tastes like vomit, like my friend Abby's
Hershey's.
One True Chocolate Hershey's does, but we won't go there. I don't really have a one true Marvel character. But I think at the moment, my favorite character is probably Loki.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun, right? He's been through so many different iterations over the years, but the TV show, they're doing a great job with. And even in the comics, have been doing great. He's now the god of stories, as opposed to the god of mischief or the god of lies. And he's having some great times.
There's one line in the TV show that made me just be like, this is perfect. And it's when they're in the train carriage, and Sylvie says to Loki, "You're drunk, aren't you?" And he says, "No, I'm full," which is how you say I'm drunk in Norwegian. It was just, and then he sings a Norwegian song, and I'm like, it's just perfection. I just love everything about it, and I'm now a full Loki convert. I always liked him, but now even more so.
That's great. It's that childhood stuff, like Andy was talking about. Like when I got asked to do this game, I've been doing games for a long time, but tabletop role-playing games don't pay terribly well, and I had 4 kids in college, right? So I'm like, well, I'm not gonna, I've been doing a little bit here and there, but not a ton, right? Certainly not any basic game design like that for maybe a decade, and doing video games and comics and novels. And then John East shows up and says, "Matt, do you want to do this role-playing?" And I'm like, "Oh my god, sure, yeah, give me that. I want that." And I've known John since I designed a game for him, the Wildstorms collectible card game back in the mid-90s for him and Jim Lee, back when John was the vice president of Wildstorm Comics, which was Jim's division of Image Comics. That he later sold to DC Comics. So that at one point, John was a publisher of Marvel, and Jim was the creative director of DC, still is. Like, wow, that was just an amazing group of people there in La Jolla, California, back in the mid-90s. Incredible folks.
I'm now thinking of all the other characters I like, but let's not go there. We could do that another time. So here's one about games design. So Lazy Cat asks, what do you enjoy in games design the most?
The reason I like games design, the reason I keep coming back to it, whether or not I'm doing role-playing games or board games or video games or whatever, is because I was this kid who always did really well in math and English, right? So it's both sides of my brain get tickled by game design. right? Especially doing narrative games like this. It's something where I get to solve a puzzle that's math and story at the same time. And that's really where my brain sits. So for me, that's really, how do I make something that's mathematically perfect that allows people to tell great stories? Man, that's just the challenge of a lifetime there. And there's so many different ways to do it, because it's not just math and science at that point, it's art as well, right? And it was Greg Stafford who really woke me up to that, because I mean, for a long time I was like, well, I'm just writing stuff, I'm having fun, I'm entertaining. And Greg always talked about game design as his art, right? I'm like, you know what? You're right. It actually is an art. And I probably didn't accord it the respect that I should have when I was younger. But as I get older, I'm like, yeah, we're all just making art. When you're making role-playing games, especially basic ones, you're giving other people tools to make their own art, right? To do their own art at home, to have their own fun. And I think that's just an amazing thing to do. So that's why I like doing game design. It's just, you're part of that.
Have you ever studied music theory?
Very, very basic stuff, right? Like I can tell you how a scale works.
Yeah, well, once you get into it, you realize it's just all maths. Like all music is just maths.
Exactly.
And that, like, you can do calculations to work out what your intervals are and check them the other way. But I would highly recommend this book, Quadrivium. Cool. It's the 4 classic liberal arts of number, geometry, music, and cosmology. So the cosmology one's all about like the music of the spheres, and it is nice. I think you'd really, really like it.
So. Yeah, for me, it's all harmonic frequencies vibrating with each other and such. Yeah, I love that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. I've actually used that kind of stuff in puzzles when I've been doing puzzle design.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, how many people would actually get that? Okay, sure.
I would.
Yeah, you always have to keep your audience in mind, right? So if you're working with, if you're doing like a crossword puzzle, you have people who are like words, right? If you're doing music puzzle, that kind of stuff. But that's one of the problems with puzzle, like riddles in video games, and especially in role-playing games, are always like, well, on a good day, I'll probably get that. But you never know. Somebody's just going to get stumped, and then they're stuck.
Yeah.
So if you're a good designer, you give them another route to go around. But they can have the fun with the riddle, but it shouldn't be a do or die kind of thing. So it's tricky with puzzles. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But I've done lots of design. I did a design for Milwaukee Public Museum. Had this display called the Streets of Old Milwaukee. There was a 3/4 display of a street from 1890 to 1910 in Milwaukee. And it had been up for 50 years, and every kid in Wisconsin has probably been there on a field trip at one point or another. And like, we have to refurbish it, but we can't tear it down. So what are we going to add to it? So they hired me on to do an interactive audio adventure that was basically a choose your own adventure that you made the decision by walking in one direction or another. So every time you're like, okay, you're trying to find Houdini's lost paycheck. It's somewhere hidden here. You have to find clues. And do you want to go over here or over here? And there were Bluetooth beacons that would pick up whichever way you went as you went. It was just crazy fun, right? But it's one of those things that, it's not sold. I don't even know. I probably put it on my website, but it's not where you can. I don't even know if it's working anymore, because it was like 10 years ago. But it was just a blast to do that kind of stuff. Wild installations of history and lessons and stories, and a little bit of math and science that tossed in as well.
What about you, Andy? Are you typing again? Are you typing an answer to someone?
It looked like you were. I was, but it's okay. I pulled out really quickly. Again, this is really disappointingly dull to say ditto. If I was to sum it all up, the number of words there that spun out, one single one really does nail it home for me, and it's the puzzle of it all. I get fascinated by puzzles, and I'm particularly fascinated by role-playing games, because there is not a single answer to that puzzle. Right. There's completely different answers for each, not just setting, but each style that you might have in that setting. Marvel, for example, since that's the topic of the day, it deals in lots of different tropes and deals in lots of different types of genres, and there's lots of different answers for how you could spin out a really good game using different types of mechanics. That puzzle is fascinating. And I think an earlier question really does nail home the fact that it is a puzzle and there's not a single answer. And that was, what do you think makes for a good superhero game? And is that the same as what's needed for a good Marvel game? And even that alone, the puzzling out that particular answer is just what drives you forward. It's exciting. And it is, well, at least for me, the geek that I am, super exciting because of that balance of numbers, words, settings, storytelling, the narrative, and pulling it all together. Yeah, love it.
Same here. I mean, for like for instance, this edition of the Marvel game is very different from the previous edition that Cam Banks did for Marvel, with Margaret Weiss for the Cortex system, right? Which I helped work on it. I thought it's a great game. I love it. I adore Cam. He's a great designer. I didn't want to go through the same path that he did, right? I mean, specifically, I'm like, well, that was Cam's game. Cam did his game. It's done now. It's been out of print for, it's been like 10 years since it debuted at that point. I'm like, well, we'll do something entirely new and try to keep up with a different solution for this puzzle, as you say. And I think that's valuable. Some people are like, why isn't it just like the old version? I'm like, well, I think we should do something new. It's the old version. One of the secrets about role-playing games too is that just because they're out of print doesn't mean they're dead. You can go buy a copy of it someplace and play it forever, right? It doesn't matter. You can still play all 4 of the previous editions to this game, right? Now, I think you should play our game, but that's okay. We actually had a guy at Gen Con who's like, how do I get my group of players who has been playing Phase Rip for 30 years to switch over to this? I'm like, man, I wouldn't try. You've been
go enjoy yourself
for 30 years. Go ahead. Keep at it. Why would you want them to change? You're having a good time. Give it a shot if you want to. I certainly don't want to discourage you from trying our game, but that's that kind of history for a game is hard to buy for anybody. You can't come up with that, right? Have to go 30 years back in time just to try. So
we've only got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to do 2. There's a few questions here, but there's one which you've hinted at already. But just what was it like working for Marvel? Would you do it again? Can we expect any more collaboration?
Right, I'm still doing it. We got the X-Men book I'm working on. There's a Spider-Verse book after that. We have plans for other stuff in the works. I would work with this team any day. Right, they're a great group of people. Wonderful folks, not just the 3 guys that I've worked with directly, but all their support staff, PR people like Haley Strickman and et cetera, Tim Chang. It's all the different people at the office. I mean, I got to meet a lot of them at Comic-Con too. I ran into Nick Lowe, who's the editor of the Spider-Man comic books, right? He's like, this is such a great game. I want to give it to all my writers. I'm like, oh my God, what just the kind of support you get from these folks and the enthusiasm that you get from them across the board. Of course, I'd work with them again on any kind of a project. So why not? And I recommend, if you get the chance, you do so. It's good. It's good fun.
And at the start of the stream, we didn't get time to talk about it because I shuffled us along to the Marvel questions. But you held up a book that you'd worked on with your son. Could you hold that up again?
Oh, sure.
I didn't get a chance to say at the time, but I absolutely love the fonts and the design.
Yeah, it's pretty, isn't it?
It's aesthetic of that. And you said that there's going to be more in that series. I'm kind of hoping they'll have the same aesthetic. They
do, actually. There's a whole series on it's by Topics Media, I believe. And
excellent.
They basically hire guys like me to do one-shot adventures for them at the same time because honestly, I don't have a whole lot of time. I wouldn't be working on doing a whole book like that because I'm busy with the Marvel stuff and everything else. But they say, let's do a 6,000-word adventure and you can bring your kids in. I'm like, yes. All the fun and none of the, and it still gives me plenty of time to do my work. That's actually fun work. Well, my work is fun anyway. What the hell am I saying? But it's fun work with my kids.
Yeah. Extra fun work.
Exactly.
So that brings us almost to the end of the stream. Andy, is there anything I've forgotten that we should have asked Matt or that we need to tell the viewers about future streams?
Other than, why are you so cool, Matt?
I know, right?
No. I thank you. You guys are the cool ones. You're having me in here. I really appreciate it. It's been lots of fun. We should do it more than every couple of years. Tell people I'm coming to Dragon Meet. I'm going to be at Dragon Meet on December 2nd in London. I'm going to be one of the guests there. So if you're in that direction or out that way, come out and see me. I'm going to be at Gamehole Con here in a couple of weeks in Madison, Wisconsin as well. UConn in Ann Arbor, Michigan here a few weeks after that. And they just announced I'm going to be a guest of honor with my son Marty at Genghis Con in February in Denver. And of course, I'll be at all the other conventions I usually am. So there you go.
Well, we're hoping to arrange a meetup at Dragon Meet, still to be confirmed, but fingers crossed we might be able to do that.
That'd be awesome.
Well, And thank you again. Thank you so much for coming. I genuinely think this last hour has been an absolute masterclass in games design, and I could have just listened to you forever. So thank you for coming. Thank you to our patrons, as always, who make the streams possible. Thanks to our lovely Discord community, patrons and non-patrons alike. Please do come and join us there. And we will be back next week with another edition of Inside the Rookery. Until then, all that remains for me to say is good night. Caw-caw, caw-caw, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.